The Professors and the Pogrom. Responses to October the 7th. How was the worst anti-Semitic pogrom since the Holocaust reframed as resistance and liberation? This talk seeks to register and understand the deeper causes of the appalling reaction of parts of the Western academic left to the massacre perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. For the mask did not just slip, it was ripped off joyfully, ecstatically even, as if at the end of a masquerade. And what stood revealed was how far the decomposition has progressed of a significant part of what passes itself off as the international left. So how was the worst anti-Semitic pogrom since the Holocaust reframed as resistance and liberation? In part, it is because a large part of the academic left now views the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of settler colonial studies, and the entire history of the Zionist movement and the Jewish state as Zionist Settler Colonialism. Derek Spitz is a trustee of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, a member of the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and a barrister at 1 Essex Court. He acts and advises in cases involving antisemitism and writes in Fathom and the Journal of Contemporary Antisemitism.
And offer a very, very warm welcome to Derek Spitz. Derek is one of our Board of Trustees at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. And he's a barrister in London. And he has been doing some research on bringing together responses on campus of the professors and the pogrom. I hope you don't quite mean to exclude everyone who is not a professor, although perhaps that's an English strangeness. My name is David Hirsch. I'm the academic director of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, and I will hand over, I was going to say I will hand straight over to Derek Spitz, but that's not looking like the best bet at this very second. I think I will do that now. Derek, over to you, and thank you very, very much for being here, and very keen to hear what you have to say. Derek.
That's great. Thanks very much, David, and welcome everyone who's attending. I will have some slides that I will put up in due course, and I hope to show a video clip, provided I can work out the screen sharing, but that should be in order. So if I kick us off then, the talk seeks to register and to understand the deeper causes of the appalling reaction of parts of the Western academic left to the massacre perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. For the mask did not just slip, it was ripped off joyfully, ecstatically even, as if at the end of a masquerade. And what stood revealed was how far the decomposition has progressed of a significant part of what passes itself off as the international left. First, let us review some examples from the miscellany while recording for us the existential estrangement that trails in their wake.
Derek, can I just suggest you can maximize your slides so that you show the slide rather than your whole screen?
It's probably beyond my skill set, David.
If you go down to the bottom right,
yeah,
it's one of those icons. Next. No, next one after that. That's it.
Okay.
Cool. Sorry, go on.
We're not going to actually be able to do it that way, I'm afraid.
You can't see it yourself.
There we are. Joseph Massad, professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University, writing in the Electronic Intifada on the morning after the 7th of October massacre, spoke of, quote, an innovative Palestinian resistance, end quote, in quotes, stunning videos of Operation Al-Aqsa flood. For him, this was the Palestinian War of Liberation. Readers were invited to marvel with Professor Massad at the, quote, shocking success of the Palestinian offensive, end quote. The, quote, the major achievement of the resistance, its takeover of several Israeli settler colonies near the Gaza boundary and even as far away as 22 kilometers, as in the case of Ofakim. Of course, these Israeli settler colonies are inside the recognized international borders of Israel proper. And if they are settler colonies, that tells you all you need to know about the popular favorite From the River to the Sea. Professor Massad's article shared exhilarated reports that thousands of Israelis were fleeing through the desert on foot, with many still hiding in settlements more than 24 hours into the resistance offensive. Under the subheading Jubilation and Awe, he wrote that the sight of the Palestinian resistance fighters storming Israeli checkpoints separating Gaza from Israel was astounding. There were, quote, jubilant Arabs glued to the news, resistance fighters who marveled at the rows of abandoned Israeli tanks. For the author, apparently aflame with excitement, this was, quote, the stunning victory of the Palestinian resistance. In a surprise to no one, it's recently been announced that Professor Massad will teach a course at Columbia University next year on Zionism. Lake Micah, the assistant editor at Harper's Magazine, put it this way, quote, to search for an analog seems almost inappropriate to Palestinians' world historical audacity to seize the components of self-determination for themselves. Warming to his theme, he explained how the idiom of liberation invents itself anew with each instance that the yoke of bondage is sloughed off. A near centuries pulverized overtures towards ethnic realization of groping for a medium of existential latitude. Before reaching his celebratory punchline, these things culminate in drastic actions in need of no apologia. The thrum of history as it develops is one of force. Its inertia and advance require some momentum. Now the prose is clotted, the rhythm onanistic, but the sentiment is clear. There are no, nor should there be any, limits on the glorious, ecstatic violence of the oppressed. They're on a world historical mission. Then there is Cornell University professor of history, Russell Rickford, addressing a rally at Cornell on the 15th of October, that is more than a week after the massacre was carried out. Rickford said of the Hamas pogrom that, quote, it was exhilarating, it was energizing, and that, quote, Palestinians of conscience were, quote, able to breathe for the first time in years. And he went on, and if they weren't exhilarated by this challenge to the monopoly of violence, by this shifting of the balance of power, then they would not be human. I was exhilarated. A few days later, realizing perhaps that not everyone felt similarly exhilarated by the torture, rape, beheading, butchering, burning, slaughter, and mass murder of grandmothers, grandfathers, men, women, children, babies, whole communities, entire generations, Jews, Arabs, Bedouin, Thai, Professor Rickford thought better of it all, or at least of how he had said it all. Quote, I recognize that some of the language I used was reprehensible and did not reflect my values. I need not pass the apology in any detail to notice how Rickford attributes the moral collapse of the enunciator to the infelicities of enunciation, rather than to his values, which he cordons off to preserve unimplicated. He recapitulates this process of splitting off more than once. Quote, "I apologize for the horrible choice of words that I used in a portion of a speech that was intended to stress grassroots African-American, Jewish, and Palestinian traditions of resistance to oppression." A few mischosen words then, much to be regretted. The sentiment behind them, he can assure us, is entirely noble. However, Professor Rickford does not really say which African-American or Jewish traditions of resistance to oppression he has in mind that supposedly draw exhilaration from mass murder in quite the way he did. And more than 24 hours after the pogrom on the 8th of October, when sufficient details about its scope and character were already plainly available, Professor Gilbert Achcar in the Department of Development
I think have other people lost Derek for a moment, or is it just me?
No, Eric's gone. We can't hear him. I think his screen's frozen.
Well, I assume he will be back shortly. I think he's gone out altogether and he's hopefully coming back.
To come back, he should be aware that we are not seeing him.
Derek, are you back? You're muted, I think.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I think you just froze, Derek, and disappeared,
Yeah.
and now you are back.
I'm back. Professor Achcar did go on to criticize Hamas from a tactical, perhaps even a strategic point of view, although not, mind you, from a moral point of view, by pointing out that the belief Hamas could achieve victory through intimate mass murder was magical thinking, the stuff, as it were, of dreams. Judith Butler is one of the most recognized and celebrated contemporary American philosophers and a scholar of gender studies. Several years ago now, she notoriously expressed the view that it was, quote, important to understand Hamas and Hezbollah as progressive, as part of the global left. I'm going to try and play you a video clip of part of her response to the 7th of October.
Different views. We can have different views about Hamas as a political party. We can have different views about armed resistance. But I think it is more honest and historically correct to say that the uprising of October 7th was an act of armed resistance. It is not a terrorist attack, and it's not an anti-Semitic attack. It was an attack against Israelis, and I did not like that attack. I have gone public with this. I have gotten in trouble for saying it was, for me, anguishing. Yes. It was anguishing. It was terrible. However, I would be very foolish if I then decided that the only violence in the scene was the violence done to Israeli people. The violence done to Palestinians has been happening for decades. This was an uprising that comes from a state of subjugation and against a violent state apparatus. Okay, let us be clear. Now, you can be for or against armed resistance, you can be for or against Hamas, but let us at least call it armed resistance, and then we can have a debate about whether we think it's right or whether they did the right thing, whether a different strategy. But the problem is if you call it armed resistance, you are immediately thought to be in favor of armed resistance and in favor of that armed resistance and that tactic. It's like, well, actually, maybe not that tactic. And we can discuss armed resistance. You know, it is an open debate.
So for Judith Butler, then, the Hamas pogrom is a matter of armed resistance. In her considered judgment, childlike in its faux naivete, she, quote, did not like it. But her fundamental point is that what Hamas did should be debated as one possible tactic among others. It might be a good tactic, it might be a bad one. So what she does is she strips out the moral questions that arise from the particular kind of violence that Hamas adopted, and she turns it into a discussion of nothing more than tactics, to applause, as you obviously saw. For her, in this clip, which is in March 2024, some 5 months after the event, it apparently raises only tactical questions. And I would like to play you a very, very short further clip, and this is Judith Butler at the same event, commenting on the gender-based violence that took place on October the 7th at the Nova Festival.
There is documentation for the claims made about the rape of Israeli women. Okay, if there is documentation, then we deplore that. We absolutely deplore that. There is no question. But we want to see that documentation, and we want to know that it is right. Okay, there is no crime in insisting that we get that documentation.
And again, without laboring the point, it's obviously the case that there's no crime in requesting documentation, but the way this observation is structured and the way it departs from the ordinary approach that one takes, at least on the face of things, to allegations of gender-based violence is significant. It's significant coming from Butler, given the work that Butler has done in the past in relation to questions of gender. This presentation focuses on the intellectual and moral collapse of a significant part of the international academic left, but it's worth noting briefly that social media was also quite beside itself, awash with elation. Thus, we were told that decolonization is not a metaphor, that today should be a day of celebration for supporters of democracy and human rights, as Gazans break out of their open-air prison and Hamas fighters cross into their colonizers' territory. The struggle for freedom is rarely bloodless, and we shouldn't apologize for it, we were told. We were also told that, quote, we are full of pride, we are really, really full of joy of what has happened, and that you have to go away from here and go. This was just the start for you here. When we hear the resistance, the Al-Aqsa flood, we must turn that flood into a tsunami over the whole world. What, we were asked, did you all think decolonization meant? Vibes, papers, essays, losers? And in one striking instance of moral narcissism, dressed up as anti-racist indignation, we saw a performative radicalism that found it sickening and, quote, a bit racist, not that Hamas had just perpetrated a massacre, mostly of Jewish people, all living within the internationally recognized borders of the State of Israel, but instead that some would presume to describe the massacre perfectly accurately as it happens as a pogrom. All of which brings to mind Walter Benjamin's observation in the last lines of the epilogue to the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, that fascism tends towards the aestheticization of politics. Welcome to the grim theater of Linksfascismus. So when did pogroms go progressive? Leon Trotsky, in his classic work 1905, described the world-destroying absence of limit in the unfolding of an Eastern European pogrom. And he said the following: "The doss-house tramp is king, a trembling slave an hour ago, hounded by police and starvation. He now feels himself an unlimited despot. Everything is allowed to him. He is capable of anything. He is the master of property and honor, of life and death. If he wants to, he can throw an old woman out of a third-floor window together with a grand piano. He can smash a chair against a baby's head, rape a little girl while the entire crowd looks on, hammer a nail into a living human body. He exterminates whole families. He pours petrol over a house, transforms it into a mass of flames, and if anyone attempts to escape, he finishes him off with a cudgel. A savage horde comes tearing into the Armenian almshouse, killing old people, sick people, women, children. There exist no tortures, figments of a feverish brain maddened by alcohol and fury, at which he need ever stop. He is capable of anything. He dares everything. God save the Tsar." I don't think we need to be reminded of the unbearable footage of the 7 October massacre, which was shown to international journalists to try to combat the rapid and perverse growth of efforts to minimize or deny the pogrom. So how did parts of the academic left reframe the worst anti-Semitic pogroms since the Holocaust as resistance and liberation? In part, it is because a large part of the academic left, taking up residence in the flatlands, now views the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of settler colonial studies and the entire history of the Zionist movement and the Jewish state as Zionist Settler Colonialism. This paradigm divides the world into a crude and unbridgeable binary of colonizers and the colonized, oppressor and oppressed, whites and people of color. It presents itself as a form of engaged scholarship, but settler colonial studies also reframes and embraces a very particular kind of violence, the kind of violence Hamas perpetrated on the 7th of October, pogromist violence without limit or restraint. Frantz Fanon occupies a position at the intellectual heart of settler colonial studies. He is celebrated today as an inspiration and founder of the research program. But Fanon had a particular fascination with violence, seeing it as a cleansing act of self-constitution, a redemptive act of regeneration. This fascination echoes through his book, The Wretched of the Earth. The first chapter, concerning violence, is a paean to the therapeutic effects of violence for the colonial subject. Even if it is necessary to contextualize Fanon's treatment of revolutionary violence within the specific historical context of the armed struggle of the FLN in Algeria, nevertheless, there remains an irreducible core that both advocates and justifies violence, attributing to it cathartic and self-actualizing attributes for the colonial subject. National liberation, wrote Fanon, is always a violent phenomenon. Decolonization cannot come as a result of a friendly understanding. The naked truth of decolonization evokes for us the searing bullets and blood-stained knives which emanate from it. Fanon continued, "For if the last shall be first, this will only come to pass after a murderous and decisive struggle between the two protagonists. From birth it is clear that this narrow world, strewn with prohibitions, can only be called into question by absolute violence. For Fanon, the zones of colonizer and colonized were delineated as a stark binary. Follow the principle of reciprocal exclusivity, he advised. No conciliation is possible, for of the two terms, one is superfluous. He gave violence a constitutive role. For the colonized people, this violence, he says, because it constitutes their only work, invests their characters with positive and creative qualities. It becomes a path to freedom. Quote, the colonized man finds his freedom in and through violence. Ultimately, for Fanon, violence is a cleansing force. And he affirms the way in which, quote, the violence which has ruled over the ordering of the colonial world, that same violence will be claimed and taken over by the native. This happens at the moment when, deciding to embody history in his own person, he surges into the forbidden waters. And for the avoidance of doubt, quote, the destruction of the colonial world is no more and no less than the abolition of one zone, its burial in the depths of the earth, or its expulsion from the country. Fanon goes on, the natives' challenge to the colonial world is not a rational confrontation of points of view. It is not a treatise on the universal. Now, for present purposes, I put to one side the fact that, as Simon Sebag Montefiore has correctly explained, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the decolonization narrative is dangerous and false. It does not accurately describe either the foundation of Israel or the tragedy of the Palestinians, and it is long overdue for serious challenge. All that is plainly so, but my point is a narrower one. For Fanon, the exhortation to violence accompanying decolonization and the violence itself are, in the words of social theorist Moshe Pastoni, regarded per se as inherently emancipatory. Now compare Fanon's praise poem to the violence of the colonized with the Hamas Covenant of 1988, the preamble to which contains the following pithy observations, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And, quote, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It needs all sincere efforts. And then to the infamous but still underreported Article 7 of the Covenant, quote, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind the stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. And Article 15, in the face of the Jews' usurpation of Palestine, it is compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. I want to turn now to some thoughts about the South African alternative. This is quite important given the way in which South Africa is often used as an analogy, a pretty poor analogy in my view, but an analogy that carries a kind of rhetorical and emotional charge over onto a different conflict involving different protagonists who seek, as it were, to borrow from the emotional affect that attaches to aspects of the South African struggle. But I want to put forward the South African experience as an alternative to the colonial and settler colonizing analysis that I've sketched out very briefly a few moments ago. Back in the days when the decent left was still a majority, it used to say that the organizational forms adopted during the course of a struggle prefigured the institutional forms that leftists hoped to build after that struggle had succeeded. Democratic modes of struggle offered a seedbed for the democratic institutions it was hoped would then grow and bear fruit. The old left grounding in social democratic theory, universalist forms of analysis, and Enlightenment principles led to a very different attitude to violence. Consider the example of the democratic organs of working class power concentrated in the independent non-racial trade union movement in South Africa, first in the Federation of South African Trade Unions, FASATU, and then in its successor, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. Those workshops of shop floor democracy were the laboratories in which militant but measured trade unionism took advantage of a newly minted legal right to strike and developed the unfair labor practice jurisprudence as one instance of an embryonic culture based on the rule of law. The new South African Constitution, one of the most progressive anywhere, was decidedly not born of a project that celebrates the violence of the colonized as intrinsic and therapeutic. The constitutional guarantees to hold executive power to account and protect minority rights are an achievement to be celebrated as an entrenchment of the rule of law. That is the sort of thing the decent left used to care deeply about. Homegrown trade union power, for example, was one of the preconditions for and cornerstones of constitutional democracy in South Africa. But that power looks nothing like Fanon's searing bullets and blood-stained knives, nor the rapture of his engaged acolytes. Nor should the oppressed be treated as if they lacked all agency. Even in the face of material constraints on the scope of that agency, there are always choices to be made. Consider again the South African resistance movement. It was never a principle or policy of the ANC's armed struggle in South Africa to attack and randomly murder South African civilians. It was never tempted by the depravities of Hamas. The form of violence adopted by the ANC in December 1961 was to launch a campaign of non-lethal sabotage. And even that campaign of sabotage was subject to significant contemporary opposition from within the ANC. Moreover, in 1980, the ANC signed a declaration of adherence to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and Protocol 1 of 1977, which states that, quote, parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants. This was an almost unprecedented action by a liberation movement. During the Rivonia trial for the founding of the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, or MK, Nelson Mandela explained the specific and unusual form taken by the ANC's turn to violence by reference to the need to canalize and control violence to avoid, quote, outbreaks of terrorism, which would produce an intensity of bitterness and hostility between the various races of the country, which is not produced even by war. In June 1961, Mandela's arguments on armed struggle, presented to the joint executives of the Congress Alliance, were concerned with the need to preempt and prevent indiscriminate terrorism, precisely the thing that is now exalted by a significant part of the academic left, and often, one might add, exalted, purporting to borrow from the South African liberation struggle. As Mandela put it, quote, look, this thing has already started in our country. Let us take the same decision and lead, because otherwise it will just deteriorate into a terrorist movement. And if it's a terrorist organization, it's going to lead to the slaughter of human beings. Let us enter and lead. The ANC's commitment to avoiding extensive violence against civilians is striking. The sensibility was deeply embedded organizationally, and it was more than merely a matter of tactics. It had something to do with an implicit commitment to universal political morality and an explicit awareness that indiscriminate violence against civilians would also have a terrible human cost and threaten post-apartheid reconstruction. To repeat, it was never a principle or policy of the ANC in South Africa to attack and randomly murder South African civilians. The same cannot be said of many of the forms of Palestinian struggle. To ignore the starkness of this qualitative difference is surely to indulge in the racism of low expectations. The oppressed have agency. They are moral human beings. They only live in an ironclad world of no options if they have first been turned into metaphors, made into the bearers of Western projections, in short, orientalized. I want to conclude by referring to the work of Moshe Pastoni in a little bit more detail in considering the relationship between violence and politics. Pastoni has elaborated on the connection between forms of violence and forms of politics as follows. I would like to suggest, he says, that there is a fundamental difference between movements that do not target civilians randomly, such as the Viet Minh and Viet Cong and the ANC, and those that do, such as the IRA, Al-Qaeda, and Hamas. This difference is not simply tactical, but profoundly political. A relation exists between the form of violence and the form of politics. That is, I want to suggest that the sort of future society and polity implicitly expressed by the political praxis of militant social movements that distinguish military from civilian targets differs from that implied by the praxis of movements that make no such distinction. The latter tend to be concerned with identity. In the broadest sense, they are radically nationalist, operating on the basis of a friend-foe distinction that essentializes a civilian population as the enemy and closes off the possibility of future coexistence. For that reason, the programs of such movements present little in the way of socioeconomic analysis aimed at transforming social structures, which should not be conflated with social services, which movements may or may not provide. Two very different visions of the relationship between politics and violence. The Second Intifada, which began in September 2000, involved setting off bombs, frequently suicide bombs, on buses, in pizza parlors, discotheques, and Passover seders. It was a devastating blow to the Israeli left, from which it has not recovered. It's already obvious, indeed it was obvious very soon after October the 7th, that the Hamas pogrom sounds the death knell for the fantasy of a one-state solution. If its invocation was always fantastical, after the 7th of October, it has become morally grotesque. For the Hamas pogrom asks and answers the question whether the principal grievance is not, in Shani Moore's words, the absence of a desired nation state, but rather the existence of another one. In any event, the ramifications of that day are also, or at least they should be, far-reaching for the academic left's research program of settler colonial studies. Its reaction to the Hamas pogrom announces that paradigm's degeneration. And I'll stop there so that we have a good deal of time for questions.
Thank you, Derek. Lots and lots going on there, I think. And I think there will be questions and comments from the people in the room. So let's just give people a minute. I mean, I'm just trying to work out for myself exactly what Judith Butler is saying in her kind of somewhat ambivalent or apparently ambivalent response. I mean, what does it mean to you when she says she finds it anguishing? We have to accept that it's counter-violence, and she personally doesn't like it. And if there's rape, then show us the documentation. But if you do show us the documentation, then we don't like that either. That's also anguishing. What do you read into that? What do you think she's really saying?
I will sort of address it fairly well, tentatively at first. I mean, I think that she's more comfortable talking about what Hamas did as an instance of armed resistance. It's difficult to see, and I don't think that the conventional understanding of armed resistance will include many of the forms of violence that that Hamas pogrom took. But what she wants to do is evacuate the moral dimension from the debate, quickly move from the specificities of what's involved, or what was involved on October the 7th, to the way she describes a broader context and a long experience of counter-violence, and then to debate this simply as a matter of tactics. And when it comes to the question of the sexual violence that took place on October the 7th, I mean, she is certainly not the only one who has been part of a shocking effort at denialism, and an insistence on, I mean, what Judith Butler does is, rather than say, well, in the first instance anyway, when claims of sexual violence are articulated or brought forward, we treat them as on their face as plausible and as requiring investigation. That obviously doesn't mean that at the end of the day they are simply accepted. They will be investigated. But the starting point is that we believe what is being said. Not in this case, which is surprising, and not from Judith Butler, which perhaps is less surprising these days, but still carries a degree of surprise, because Judith Butler's retort is, let's show us the documents. Show us the documents. I mean, my own sense is that there's a kind of moral narcissism that is expressed in the highly wrought way in which she chooses her phrasing. She agonizes through her articulations, and she juxtaposes this, what she thought was not nice, with what she found anguishing. And there's a sense, it's not easy to put one's finger on exactly what it is, but I think it's a kind of a narcissistic style that doesn't really get traction, at least in a world of common sense.
So narcissistic in the sense that the problem was that it causes her anguish.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it, and also the sense in which she locates herself somewhat above the fray, and her feelings are the feelings that are given space to be articulated. And the applause was pretty striking, I thought, too, in that clip. And so it could be that when one moves on and takes her at her word and says, well, let's debate this as a question of tactics, it may well be, and she certainly says it's the case, that this isn't a tactic of which she would approve, but she's already diluted what happened to turn it into one tactic among others.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in also the fact it's also about her at Berkeley, presumably. Like, she kind of says what a martyr she's already been for questioning some of the tactics. In other words, she's been brave. She's questioned the tactic of murder and rape. And there's the feeling very much that she is in a debate in a particular, in Berkeley, presumably, like she needs to remain amongst the the people in Berkeley who she sees broadly as her people, even if she wants to then shrink from some of the conclusions that they are excitedly running towards.
Yeah. And the other aspect to it is the construction of Judith Butler as taking a brave position in criticizing what Hamas carried out. It's a sense that, I mean, in some ways, that tells you a lot about the state of a part of the international left. If to criticize what Hamas did on the 7th of October takes a degree of bravery in the constituencies in which Butler finds herself at home, that tells you quite a lot about that home.
Yeah. Anna, you've got your hand up. I think you're muted for a moment and you have no camera.
Hi, I have my camera, but I cannot turn it on. Wait a second. I don't know why. You stopped it.
Did I stop it?
Yes.
Let me see if I can fix that.
But I can also talk without camera. It's not a problem at all.
Does that fix it?
Wait.
Can
you see me now?
Yes, I apologize to everybody. I've stopped all your cameras. Please, everybody, put your cameras back on. Anna, hi.
Hi. Hi, Derek. Thanks a lot for this super interesting lecture. Just one word about Judith Butler. My impression was that maybe I will put it a bit too strongly, but my impression was that actually she, non-directly, but she accused Israel and Israeli women of manipulation in a way that she brings this thought to the scene that probably they are lying because they want our compassion or something like that, and we shouldn't trust them. But I wanted to ask you about Frantz Fanon, because I found it super interesting and fascinating what you were saying about the way Frantz Fanon thought is used by the let's say anti-colonial contemporary left. So I've read recently about the very interesting references of Jean Amery to Frantz Fanon, and Amery was referring to Fanon as he said basically that he was very enthusiastic was what Fanon was writing about the position of a colonized individual, because you could compare it to the situation of a Jew before the war and during the war. And also, I think that's my point of view, the Jean Amery and Frantz Fanon concepts of violence were in some points similar in the way that they saw, like they were always asking about the direction of a violence. They were saying basically that violence always has a direction, and this is what defines the nature of this violence. So my question would be, would you say that is it anything from Frantz Fanon that we could save actually, or we could defend against the misuse of Frantz Fanon thought nowadays? Or do you think it's rather in the Frantz Fanon concepts itself that it's too open to such misuse as we can see today?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I would say this. I think that the understanding of violence is only one part of a much larger body of work that does a lot of things on very different levels. And Fanon has this, I think that I'm getting it right, but please correct me if I'm not. He has this description of his father, I think it is, talking to him and saying, when they talk to you about Black people, sorry, when they're talking about the Jews, they're talking about you. In other words, he brings together in that way comparable experiences in quite a nuanced articulation, if I've got it correct. So I have no doubt that there is a lot outside the particular focus on violence. I think your question is a deeper one in a way, because your question is, well, even in his concept of of violence, is there not something there that one can see as being creative or productive or somehow progressive? I struggle a bit with that, and I'm not really in a position to fully understand what Amory does with it, but I struggle with it because when one compares it to the counterexample that I was articulating in South Africa, there were very different strands of political organization in South Africa. And the ANC strand was one strand, much more sort of familiar in terms of Enlightenment concepts, a social democratic or socialist vision, and an organization around economic issues and civil and political rights. There were also other strands, like the Black consciousness strand, which was far more focused on questions of Black identity and the articulation of self-sufficiency. And there's a way, and a hostility to white progressives. So that view of the world tended to divide on the basis of racial identity in a quite a binary way, and borrowed from Fanon's thinking to a significant degree. My sense is it's quite it may be possible, but there's quite a lot of work that one would need to do, I think, to draw Fanon out of the role that he has been cast in, which his views on violence lend themselves to, I think. And often I think people try and save most wider aspects of Fanon's work, and don't quite know what to do with this, the concept of violence. But the idea of it being self-constitutive, I struggle with.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Who else wishes to ask or to participate? I was wondering, Derek, if I mean, it's quite easy to, well, it's quite easy and it's quite important to look at the very worst examples of academics, which you've done. You know, you pick out Joseph Massad and other people who are kind of literally getting very excited over the day of 7th of October. But there were other more, I suppose, plausible or mainstream responses. So not to glorify or to completely deny, but perhaps to trivialize in various kinds of ways, to downplay this violence as compared to, you know, some other violence, either the violence of Israel or the occupation or colonialism in general. Or so what I'm getting to, I guess, is that there are much more apparently moderate and plausible ways of really ignoring 7th of October.
Yeah. I mean, two things come to mind. The one is, first, just staying with the worst cases. What was striking about that to me was the enjoyment. It was horrifying. It was the ecstasis. It was the excitement. It was all of that went beyond conceptual analysis of the position, but was inflamed in some way. And I wonder about that. I wonder what it was about. It was almost as if the worse the violence, the greater the level of excitement from the people who were articulating these views. The most egregious examples. And I'm not sure, other people may have other views about that. Is there something, I haven't mentioned the word anti-Semitism, but is there something in that a kind of excess and an over and aboveness where that triggered this sort of excitement. So that's on the one side. That's the most egregious examples. The wider response, again, it's a question of how much time is allowed to the victims of an atrocity like the 7th of October to focus on themselves and their own experience of that, and to think through and conceptualize and make meaning from that experience before they are told, but what about? And there needs to be space for the what about as well, I think, and it's possible to hold two thoughts in mind, which are in some tension with one another, and it's a necessary thing to be able to do. But I think that there is something about an effort to cut short the need for victims of the 7th of October to be able to do what needs to be done in their own time. And I think the more subtle analyses that turn outwards towards a geopolitical or a historical or a contextual too quickly close off that sort of space. And I think that it's problematic in that sense.
Yeah, I absolutely relate to that. I remember thinking that people responded far too quickly. Like people responded before you could even really know what had happened properly, or before you could really understand the details of some of what had happened. People were already responding according to their own pre-existing frameworks of what was going on in the Middle East, in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And by the same token, almost, I remember thinking, well, some people have responded with excitement and with glorification, but they haven't, maybe they don't yet know really exactly what's happened. I remember one fairly high-profile person had a tweet that said, "This is what the liberation will look like," and it was a tweet that showed an image of a bulldozer knocking down the fence. And I remember thinking, well, maybe he doesn't really know what's going on yet. And then a little bit of me thought, given the benefit of the doubt, but then the rest of me thought, well, no, he's never done anything to deserve the benefit of the doubt. And of course, in the whatever it is, 400 days since, he's never said, oh, well, I jumped the gun a little bit. I did, I spoke before I really knew what was happening. None of that, very little of that happened.
Yeah. I also thought that in a similar sort of way. Well, maybe it's that the response was too quick, and some reflection and reconsideration will lead to a moderation of that response, and we will see public retractions and reformulations. Not much.
Nothing. Yeah.
There's a second theme that comes out of this a little bit, and it's in what's happening with the categories and concepts that we use to describe these sorts of events. And the charges were available. The charge sheet, in a way, was prepared before the Israeli Defense Force really started to respond. And the label of genocide was thrown out early, very early, before one could possibly say anything. It was there, and there's this sort of, I mean, I don't know what the answer to it is, and in terms of the work that the center does, it seems to me that it's a strand that's worth thinking about. But it's what's happening with our concepts, because Amnesty International is a good example. They did it with the apartheid report, where they expanded the definition of apartheid and took and diluted the racial elements of that definition, so that it then could be made easier to fit with the conduct that they were trying to describe and analyze. And I think a lot of people have recognized the same sort of thing in their report on their conclusion, their finding, as if as if Amnesty International is some sort of quasi-judicial fact-finding body, but they're finding that there is a program of genocide, and they say as much. You would have thought that if you're going to make the sort of claim that Amnesty makes, you would do it by using the absolutely bog standard, fully accepted definition of genocide as it stands, because you're making a radical, far-reaching claim that's already going to run into opposition. So you would think that to make that claim stick, you use the widely known and accepted definition of the term. That's not what Amnesty does, for obvious reasons, because it's just a hopeless argument that that what has happened is genocidal in any way. So what they do is they specifically say, let's broaden the definition. And if you define something different, from that point onwards, Amnesty can say anything that they want. So they borrow from all of the associations that surround these terms, the moral associations, the affect, the revulsion that surrounds a term like apartheid and a term like genocide. They're playing on that, they're borrowing that, and they're importing it over into a situation where it doesn't fit, because they want the benefit of the sting in those sorts of concepts, as if it's not enough to describe what has been a terrible war in the terms in which it has taken place. And there's kind of, and that, what I suppose what's worrying is that's no longer the far left. In other words, that's now moved into the center of our discourse and our ways of thinking about things.
I mean, it's extraordinary that both Amnesty and the government of South Africa have admitted that it's not genocide according to the law, and therefore have asked for the law to be expanded so that it includes this in genocide, and then Israel will be guilty of genocide.
Yeah. And very interesting, you probably saw that Ireland is joining the South Africa case in the International Court, and Ireland is doing so expressly, as it says, to argue for a broader, more expansive definition of the term. So it seems to me the South African government will stick with, or try to stick with, the narrow definition, and they've got backup with the Irish, who will be arguing for the need to develop the law. But the worry is that they've got the bit between their teeth.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is if they develop the law sufficiently to include this as genocide, then actually everybody will be guilty of genocide.
Yeah.
But they haven't kind of got that far, and anyway, they're not too worried about that, because that is not likely to be to happen, right? Who else wants to come in? Who else wants to speak? I assume everybody's hands are working correctly and we're not missing something going on here. Anybody who's left comments want to articulate them? Yes. Therese, hi. You have to unmute, and you don't have a camera?
I have. Yeah, the screen's displaying in a funny manner, so I'll just speak without a face.
Okay.
The mention of the ICJ case and so on. There's been some reporting that Iran has funded South Africa's case. There seems to be a certain amount of circumstantial evidence, at least, that Iran settled the debts of the ANC. So what many seem to be interpreting as an act of altruism, social justice, and so on, if that is true, is really based in bribery and corruption. the Israel Law Center wrote to Blinken and various other people in the United States seeking investigation, and they were supported, I think, by a couple of hundred lawyers. No one seems interested in taking this up. And I have raised it with various people. And, you know, one person said, well, Iran will fall and then it will all come to light that, you know, from the records, what Iran has done. But it seems to me this has played out so far that the narrative is set, even if the documents that aren't available yet might become available, that the narrative is already set. So it seems quite disturbing that not a lot of people even want to know that this circumstantially looks like being the case.
Yeah. I don't have any better sense of the truth or falsity of the allegations than you do. I've also seen some of the circumstantial evidence, and I've seen a couple of reports that try to tease some of that out. But I haven't seen anything that would leave one confident to say that this is in fact what happened. It's plausible, though. It's plausible. I think that there probably additional considerations behind South Africa's case to the ICJ as well, and you know, to some extent, I think. I think one needs to deal with it on its merits and deal with the substance of the complaint itself. But I think that there is also displacement activity going on. This is a government that that lost its majority in the last election. This is a government that no longer looks like the liberation movement of 25, 30 years ago, and one that that has been mired in all sorts of allegations of corruption in various ways, and that in a context of an incredibly high unemployment rate, far higher than the official statistics would suggest, and a loss of the moral high ground. And so there's a sense in which those sorts of factors feed in to the decision. I think that the people who are involved in that case, for many of them, it's a long-term, it's a life's work that is coming to fruition to have the charge articulated at the International Court. Just anecdotally, watching the argument, one of the things that was striking to me was I just thought in an English court, the presentation of the South African case would have been subject to significant criticism. And I think that it would, at the end of the presentation, I think an English judge would have asked why it was that the factual presentation didn't mention the word Hamas once. And why, you know, in these courts, one has a duty to present the facts fairly and objectively. Of course, one's advocating a position, but I was surprised at how tendentious the South African presentation was. What I understand is that the team is celebrated in South Africa for the work that they've done, and it has shaped the discourse. As you say, you raise the question: is it now too late to get that onto a different kind of track? It's allowed people to use language that they felt that they weren't in a position to use before. It's given them the permission to do that, and in a sense, from that point of view, do they? How invested are they in seeing this through to a final judgment or determination 5 years or more down the line? And does that really matter, or has the damage been done already?
But yeah, not only does it license them to use the terminology, but it licenses them to insist that others use it. I don't know if people have seen that. Richard.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
you talk about the the ICJ and the ICC. Bashir, I think it was Bashir from Sudan, has been condemned. Well, there's an arrest warrant out for him with the courts. He went to South Africa and he was treated as a hero because the court is not a court as we know it in the UK. It's actually a political court. So you can't really expect anything other than a political judgment on that. You did talk about South Africa and, you know, the ANC and the liberation struggle there, possibly in comparison to Hamas. At no point did the ANC ever talk of destroying the white people, but as you say, looking at the Hamas charter, they're very specific in that they do want to destroy Israel and the Jewish people. So it's actually, I mean, academia has actually accepted the fact that the Palestinian narrative is the only narrative, and whatever Israel does is wrong. I don't know how you look at that.
Well, I mean, I think I agree with the way you've articulated it. In South Africa, the ANC and its allies, the project was never constructed around race. It was, you know, it was the Rainbow Nation. It was a national democratic revolution. It was aimed at a system rather than at individuals. And it was quite careful in the way that it framed that. That's not to try and paint it with completely rose-tinted spectacles, because there were excesses and there were abuses, and there was an effort for an accounting. But it was a very different way of seeing the world, it seems to me, compared to the settler colonial theory and analysis, which really does divide the world into unbridgeable binaries, and that leaves it very difficult to see where the room is for a common project. So I think, I mean, in some ways, the South African, the concepts through which the South African liberation movement organized and articulated its program were far more familiar, I think, to a rights-based language and discourse in democratic societies, far closer to, and then you had the shift from the Rainbow Nation to the African Renaissance, which became more complicated, I think, and whether there was an emerging racialized element that came into that project, I don't know. But very, very stark differences, and it's worth pointing that out, even though that too is quite well established. It's worth reminding people that there are different ways of conceiving of political struggle, and some are better than others for very good reasons.
I think there's no other questions or comments, in which case I will thank Derek very warmly for your research and for your presentation. This is the last London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism event of the year. It's been quite a packed year, and people can find videos of previous events on our YouTube channel. So thank you, Derek, and thank you to everyone else who has participated and who has spoken this year. And we will come back with a big program of events next year. And just a reminder to people too, if you would like to come to our conference in London in March, then find our call for papers on our website, and please send in an abstract. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
And Derek, I'm sorry to say that Arsenal are 1-0 down already at home to Crystal Palace.
Oh my goodness.
After 4 minutes, I believe, and it's just about half time. Thank you very much.
Take care.